The idea of same-sex attraction as a sign of the fall wasn't acceptable to everyone. But the question that view provoked seemed worth pursuing. What does it mean for the same-sex attracted to follow Christ? What does redemption look like for them?
The way I see it, God can mend anything. I believe that God can restore a person's sexuality in the same way that he can restore any aspect of our human life. In fact, a really good friend of mine, she had this experience herself. She used to be attracted to women and then was gloriously set free and is now dating men.
Well, I know of other stories, not of healing, but of deep desperation and despair. I have a friend who tried for years to change his attractions. He got prayed for often, and some people even tried to deliver him, casting out the demon of homosexuality. He came close to ending his own life. He finally came to accept his sexuality.
Well, I don't see a problem with that, provided he lives a celibate life. I've read moving accounts of those who embrace this call. And while it's not an easy road, it's a time-honoured path, and I believe that God's grace is poured out on those who take up their cross and walk in such costly obedience. The problem is often that churches aren't great at supporting people in that position. We're so well geared up for families, and yet can be really poor at loving and encouraging those who are single, whatever their sexuality.
And I suppose my question is whether all gay people are necessarily called to celibacy. Maybe some are called to a loving, life-uniting relationship with someone they're attracted to and in love with. Marriage, as I understand it, is God's provision for our selfish desires to be schooled into self-giving love, a means of redemption. When its work is done, it points to God's own love. Why can't same-sex relationships be redemptive in the same way?
Because the Bible doesn't give a mandate for such a life union. From Genesis to Revelation, marriage is a male-female union, and all sexual behaviour outside of that is regarded as immoral. It's not a popular message today, I know, but I can't see any good reason to abandon what the Bible consistently teaches.
I accept that the Bible gives no alternative to male-female marriage, yet I wonder if the biblical writers could have conceived of such an alternative. Their understanding would have been that for all same-sex behaviour reflected the perversion of natural desire. So the idea of same-sex attraction being natural to some, as we know today, would have been quite alien to them. Which means that we are considering a pattern of human life today, committed, loving, same-sex relationships that the Bible does not directly address. If I'm right about this, then we need to turn to broader biblical themes like truth and justice and mercy.
And inclusion. I've been reading the Bible a lot since we began this, and one of the things I've noticed is the way in which God keeps adding to his circle of friends. For example, there are rules early on in the history of Israel that exclude certain people from going to worship at the temple, such as eunuchs or foreigners. Yet later on in the great salvation story, one of the prophets announces that eunuchs and foreigners will no longer be excluded, but they will be given a name better than sons or daughters. And much later on, we see Jesus himself welcoming the people that are on the margins of society. And later on still, we see the amazement of those early Jewish disciples of Jesus as God clearly opens the door for Gentiles to become Christians, just like us.
I get what you're driving at. I can see your point, but for me, there's a really significant difference between the welcoming in of Gentiles to the church and the affirmation of same-sex relationships today. The salvation of Gentiles was promised and predicted right from the beginning when God spoke to Abraham and said that all the nations would be blessed through his offspring. And then that promise was repeated throughout Scripture, through the prophets, through the Psalms. And I just can't see an equivalent promise or prediction for same-sex attracted couples.
Yes, but doesn't the church need to remain open to God's grace, crossing more and more boundaries within human society, including those previously excluded, especially when we see people coming to faith? The fact of gay Christian couples today giving testimony to God's calling and blessing on their relationships must be reckoned with, surely.
So long as we don't just abandon the wisdom and judgment of previous generations of Christians in order to be acceptable to our society. We've got a stable and a consistent tradition on marriage and sexuality held across centuries, and continence that marriage between a man and a woman is the only right context for sex. It's only in recent decades that other positions have been argued for, and only in the Western Church, while the rest of the world church looks on in bemusement and concern.
I agree that our Christian tradition should be honoured, yet this does not mean it's not beyond question or challenge. Over the centuries, some long-standing positions have shifted, such as our stance on slavery, attitudes to women in leadership, and our pastoral responses to those who divorce and seek to remarry, to name the obvious ones. The church in every generation has the responsibility to respond faithfully to the issues of its day, looking to the Spirit of God to guide us into all truth.
The thing is, my fear is that we're going to be led more by our culture than by the Spirit of truth.
I agree. We live in an age where truth is relative and anything goes. Everyone gets to decide their own values, and our young people have never been in such peril.
We need to get back to our moorings, get back to the true freedom story of the Christian heritage.
Well, the conversation continued until it was somewhat interrupted by the appearance in the church of a same-sex couple called Shaz and Davina and their little boy, Zach.
Thank you.